For decades, Florida has waged a quiet, desperate war against the Burmese python. Night after night, hunters waded into the black, suffocating waters of the Everglades. Headlamps sliced through the thick humidity. Scientists tracked faint radio signals through waist-deep mud and dense cypress domes. Thousands of massive muscular snakes were pulled from the muck, hauled onto the asphalt, and eliminated. Yet, despite all the money and all the manpower, the invasion only spread further. The swamp was losing. Then, in 2026, officials authorized a strategy that sounds like pure science fiction. No more boots on the ground. No more massive steel traps. Instead, fleets of helicopters were prepared to rain millions of dead mice over one of America's most fiercely protected wilderness areas. Looking up from the canopy, the operation feels less like a conservation effort and more like biological warfare. The theory: this bizarre aerial assault can strike the serpents in forbidden zones, where human hands could never reach. But can a rain of dead rodents actually halt an apex predator? Or is Florida simply rolling the dice on an entirely new ecological disaster? Stick around, because the mechanics of this drop defy all logic, and the backup plan is even more terrifying. In 2025, Florida celebrated a milestone. For 10 days straight, 934 hunters from across the United States and Canada pushed deep into South Florida's backcountry. This wasn't a casual hike. The Everglades is a hostile, unforgiving landscape, a sprawling river of grass choked with sawgrass blades, sharp enough to slice through denim swarms of mosquitoes and stifling 90-degree heat. Their only target, the Burmese python. They scoured levee roads under the moonlight. They waded through treacherous canal margins. They combed endless expanses of marsh where a snake longer and heavier than a grown man can vanish into the shadows in a matter of seconds. By the time the Florida Python Challenge wrapped up, 294 pythons had been dragged out of the wild. It was an all-time high. On paper, it looked like a major victory. Public engagement was soaring, the media was running victory laps, and more apex predators were being eliminated than ever before. Since the year 2000, state officials have recorded the removal of over 23,000 wild Burmese pythons. If you look at the raw numbers, it sounds like a winning campaign, until you look at the true scale of the enemy. These massive constrictors are not native to North America. They originally arrived through the booming exotic pet trade in the 1980s and 90s. At first, they were small, cheap, and housed safely behind glass tanks, a novel exotic display for buyers who had absolutely no idea what they were actually inviting into their living rooms. Then the snakes did what they are biologically programmed to do. They grew. A 2-foot novel quickly became a 6-foot hazard. Eventually, the animals grew far too powerful and expensive to contain. Driven by owner negligence, breached enclosures, and the catastrophic destruction of breeding facilities during Hurricane Andrew in 1992, thousands of snakes washed out into the wild. Owners assumed a single freed snake wouldn't matter, but together, they introduced the Everglades to a predator it was entirely unequipped to handle. The South Florida wilderness provided the perfect breeding ground. Endless heat, abundant slow-moving water, dense impenetrable vegetation, where a camouflaged body thicker than a human thigh can remain completely invisible from just 2 feet away. The swamp offered an endless unguarded buffet of wading birds, opossums, raccoons, and deer. And it offered miles of untouched marsh where winter never gets cold enough to freeze the water and halt their spread. The swamp didn't just reject the pythons, it armored them. Over generations, this accidental release solidified into a permanent ecological machine. A python doesn't hunt like a wolf burning calories to chase down its prey. It sits perfectly still beneath the waterline, buried in the rotting brush, or resting alongside a heavily trafficked game trail. It lowers its heart rate. It waits for a warm-blooded animal to step just an inch too close. Then, the trap springs. A lightning-fast strike is immediately followed by suffocating muscular coils. Every time the prey exhales, the snake tightens. Within minutes, a living, breathing creature becomes a slow-moving bulge in the snake's belly. Feathers, fur, hooves, and bone. If it clears the jaws, the python digests it. The immediate damage was obvious to anyone looking. Massive snakes with massive appetites meant fewer native animals. But recently, the hard data became downright terrifying. In core python territories, raccoon sightings plummeted by more than 99%. Opossums dropped by nearly the exact same margin. Bobcats faced steep sudden declines. In areas where pythons had reigned the longest, marsh rabbits, cottontails, and foxes simply vanished from the earth. Trail cameras kept rolling night after night, but the lenses captured nothing. The forest floor was being hollowed out. The ecosystem was going silent. And while human hunters were catching adult snakes one by one on the levees, a massive new generation was multiplying out of reach. A mature female python can lay dozens of eggs in a single clutch, with the largest nests approaching 100 eggs. She doesn't need dry ground or clear paths, just heat-thick cover and time. This reality completely shifts how we view the 2025 record. Every captured python goes onto an official spreadsheet, but every hidden nest ticking away in the deep sawgrass continues to hatch. No one knows the exact python population across South Florida. Official estimates range widely into the tens of thousands, but darker, more realistic statistical models suggest up to 120,000 pythons are currently occupying the greater Everglades region. Now look at the record again. 294 pythons caught against an estimated 120,000. That is roughly 0.245%, not even a quarter of 1%. The most successful highly publicized hunt in Florida's history eliminated fewer than 3 snakes for every 1,000 left in the wild. This wasn't a failure of human effort, it was a mathematical failure of scale. Florida could double its hunters tomorrow. It could inflate the prize money to $1 million, deploy packs of tracking hounds, and fund endless contractor shifts. It would still miss the core engine of the invasion. The pythons aren't just surviving in the Everglades. They are manufacturing an unstoppable new population inside it. The record proved humans could catch them, but it also exposed a grim truth: capturing these predators hand-to-hand would never save the swamp. Was there another way to intervene before the Everglades was lost completely? Florida had already exhausted almost every traditional eradication method known to modern wildlife management. Search teams scanned canal banks with high-powered military-grade spotlights. K9 units tracked invisible chemical scent trails through thick, thorny brush. Remote cameras monitored nocturnal crossing points, while heavily engineered specialized traps were deployed where water and prey intersected. Biologists even tried a psychological approach, fitting captured female Judas pythons with internal radio transmitters and releasing them back into the wild. The goal wasn't to let them live, but to let them lead researchers straight to hidden breeding aggregations deep within the sawgrass. Even then, with multi-million-dollar tracking gear, the returns were agonizingly minimal. The fundamental obstacle remained unchanged. Pythons are absolute masters of camouflage. A seasoned search party could trek for miles sweeping the ground and step right over a 14-foot snake pressed flat into the mud roots and shadows. A camera might catch a massive silhouette crossing a dirt trail at midnight, but by the time a response team arrived, the swamp had swallowed it whole. The state knew exactly where the snakes were, but it couldn't catch enough of them to shift the balance. Eventually, the focus shifted from finding the snakes to making the snakes find their own demise. What if the very prey they hunted could eliminate them? Thousands of miles away on the remote island of Guam, scientists had already proved this concept worked. Decades prior, Guam was entirely overrun by invasive brown tree snakes. Hitching rides on military cargo planes, they flooded the island and climbed through the canopy, decimating native bird populations that had never evolved to defend against a nocturnal tree-climbing predator. The jungle didn't go quiet overnight. It was a slow, agonizing fade. First, specific bird calls disappeared from the dawn chorus. Then, once common species stopped appearing altogether. The snakes grew so numerous they began crawling into power substations, causing massive island-wide blackouts. The trees remained standing, but the life inside them had been entirely wiped out. By the time biologists realized the true extent of the damage, Guam had become a global cautionary tale. Once an invasive reptile heavily saturates an ecosystem, manual hunting cannot keep up. You cannot trap your way out of an invasion. They needed a weapon that didn't require humans finding individual snakes. The answer was surprisingly mundane acetaminophen, the exact same active ingredient found in everyday human painkillers. In small doses, it is highly fatal to snakes, but scattering loose white pills across a sprawling jungle floor was useless and incredibly dangerous to other wildlife. The poison needed a convincing delivery vehicle, so scientists began stuffing the toxic tablets inside dead mice. To a brown tree snake hunting blindly in the dark branches, a dead mouse looked and smelled like an easy meal. Once the snake swallowed the bait, the chemical compound went to work without a single human ever touching the animal. Florida officials took note. Guam had demonstrated an entirely different form of population control. No midnight chases through the mud, no waiting empty-handed by traps. The food itself became the delivery system. But transferring this tactic to Florida hit an immediate glaring roadblock. An adult python in South Florida can easily outgrow a canoe and outweigh a human adult. They are capable of swallowing whole deer and 6-foot alligators. A tiny frozen dead mouse tangled in a branch seemed entirely irrelevant to a giant built for massive prey. At first glance, the strategy looked downright absurd. But the Everglades isn't a flat terrain, it operates in distinct vertical layers. Down in the deep mud and the dark water sits a crowded, perilous arena ruled by alligators, snapping turtles, wading birds, and large native mammals. Directly above this danger zone lies another habitat, entirely a low tangled canopy of thick vines, low-hanging branches, and dense shrubs suspended over the water. Young Burmese pythons do not navigate the swamp like the giants pulled from the levee banks. Before they grow too large, juvenile pythons spend their early, highly vulnerable years elevated in this low vegetation. Climbing allows them to hunt smaller prey while staying safe from the terrifying threats below, including alligators, bears, and cannibalistic adult pythons that would gladly eat them. To exploit this specific behavioral quirk, each bait mouse would be dropped with a biodegradable cardboard streamer firmly attached. As the rodent fell from the skids of a low-flying helicopter, the streamer would flutter and snag on a branch, a vine, or a cluster of leaves, leaving the bait suspended midair, not rotting in the deep mud, not floating away in the river current, not accessible to ground-dwelling scavengers. By hanging above the forest floor but safely beneath the high tree canopy, the bait stayed clear of most native wildlife. This was the structural precision of the plan. The bait didn't need a computer targeting system to select its victim. The altitude did the filtering. A mouse hanging in the branches was no longer just random food dropped from the sky. It was a precise, perfectly positioned trap, placed directly in the travel path of the next generation. The mission wasn't designed to kill the largest pythons in Florida. It was designed to eliminate the young ones before they ever got the chance to grow. But could a trap engineered for juveniles actually break the back of an entire invasion? A dead mouse doesn't move. It doesn't breathe panic or struggle. To a human observer, it looks completely inert. So, why would an ambush predator, an animal built to hunt and live game, bother to swallow it? Burmese pythons are evolutionary models of patience designed to sit perfectly still in the shadows until a warm-blooded animal walks into striking range. But a thawed rodent dropped into the marsh isn't a warm, moving target. It is carrion. This is where the strategy relies on a highly specific biological vulnerability. In Florida, python eggs hatch during the sweltering, oppressive heat of July and August. Suddenly, a massive wave of newborn snakes floods into the Everglades all at once. Hundreds of thousands of neonate pythons slither out of their leathery shells. These juveniles are independent from the moment they are born. They are inexperienced, untested, and highly vulnerable to being eaten themselves. They completely lack the raw size of their parents and the survival instincts that only come with age. But above all else, they are incredibly hungry. Pythons navigate their dark world using chemical signals. Their flickering tongues pull microscopic scent particles out of the humid air and draw them into the mouth, where a specialized receptor called the Jacobson's organ translates those chemicals into a highly accurate directional map. A starving juvenile cannot afford to be a picky eater. As a frozen mouse thaws in the intense 90-degree Florida humidity, it rapidly begins to break down. It radiates a heavy, unmistakable scent of protein directly through the exact low branches where young pythons are already traveling. To an opportunistic juvenile, that scent doesn't mean danger. It means a free, effortless meal. The mouse doesn't need to mimic life. It only needs to smell like food, but once swallowed, the true mechanism of the trap triggers. And it is brutal. Physiologist Stephen Secor and fellow researchers discovered that python digestion is a violent, highly energy-intensive process. While fasting a python keeps its metabolic rate incredibly low, effectively powering down its internal organs to conserve fuel. But the moment food lands in its stomach, its entire biology shifts gears instantly. The dormant machine wakes up. The snake's heart physically enlarges, increasing in mass by up to 40%. Metabolism spikes by a factor of 40. A torrent of highly concentrated acid strong enough to dissolve solid bone and teeth floods the stomach chamber, while the intestines rapidly expand to process the meal. Ordinarily, this extreme biological overdrive allows a python to convert a massive kill into months of sustained energy. But hidden inside this specific bait is a lethal dose of acetaminophen. As the mouse breaks down in the stomach acid, the toxin is released directly into a digestive system, operating at absolute maximum capacity. The chemical circulates at terrifying speeds. The python's liver, already working in overdrive to process the sudden influx of heavy food, is forced to filter a chemical compound it is biologically incapable of neutralizing. The weapon doesn't strike from the outside. It doesn't pierce the scales. It waits patiently, letting the snake's own extreme digestive surge destroy it from within. However, a few poison mice scattered randomly across a vast wilderness won't change the course of the invasion. For this strategy to work, the aerial drops must be timed perfectly with the annual hatching cycle. The helicopters have to target the precise corridors hatchlings use: warm shorelines, historic nesting grounds, and dense impenetrable thickets where human search teams cannot set foot. From a helicopter looking down, the operation would look minimal, just faint lines of pale bait hanging silently in the branches like invisible boundary markers. The results wouldn't manifest as a swamp suddenly littered with visible carcasses. Instead, the impact would be a quiet wave of attrition juveniles that never see their second-year females, that never grow large enough to reproduce, and thousands of future nests that simply never exist. The giant adults will still populate the deep swamp. The media headlines will still feature massive captures, and human hunters will continue to pull absolute monsters from the canal banks. But beneath the visible surface of the invasion, the foundation would quietly, inevitably erode. It is a seductive, highly efficient plan, and an incredibly risky one. Because while a human hunter can look closely down the sights of a rifle and choose exactly what to eliminate, a piece of poison bait cannot. Could this desperate airborne gamble finally reclaim the Everglades, or is Florida about to accidentally poison the very ecosystem it is trying so hard to save? A bait mouse cannot choose its target. It drops from the helicopter skid. The cardboard streamer flutters in the hot wind. If everything goes exactly to plan, it snags on a low-hanging vine. It hangs in the shadows, blind and indifferent, waiting for a young python to taste the air. But the Everglades is not a controlled laboratory. It is a chaotic, unpredictable wind tunnel. Not every mouse catches a branch. Thousands of them will tear through the leaves and hit the deep mud. And the moment that bait touches the ground, the entire architecture of the plain collapses. The drop zone is no longer restricted to tree-climbing juvenile snakes. The bait is now sitting in the most heavily trafficked, ruthless scavenging arena in North America. This is where the blindness of the bait becomes a biological time bomb. To a Burmese python, a hidden dose of acetaminophen is a fatal system override. But to another animal, one of the rarest mammals on the planet, it is an instant death sentence. Felines completely lack the specific liver enzyme required to break down this common human painkiller. A dose small enough to fit inside a single mouse can trigger catastrophic, irreversible liver failure in a cat within hours. And prowling through the exact same sawgrass, hunting the exact same game trails, is the critically endangered Florida panther. Today there are roughly 120 to 230 adult panthers left in the wild. Every single one is a ghost of the swamp. They are tracked with telemetry collars, heavily guarded by federal law, and pushed to the absolute brink by highway traffic and habitat loss. Now a full-grown panther is not going to scavenge a cardboard-wrapped mouse out of the mud. That isn't how they hunt. The danger doesn't attack the panther directly. It moves invisibly, silently up the food chain. Biologists call it secondary poisoning. Imagine a raccoon foraging in the dark. It finds a dropped bait mouse, eats it, and keeps moving. A few hours later, A panther drops from a cypress tree and ambushes that raccoon. Or imagine a juvenile python that actually swallowed the hanging bait. The acetaminophen is tearing through its liver, but it isn't dead yet. It is crawling sluggishly through the brush, disoriented and exposed. A panther sees an easy meal and strikes. The panther digests the snake, and the undiluted poison transfers directly into the feline's bloodstream. The apex predator begins to slow down. Lethargy sets in, the liver shuts down, toxins flood the brain, and within days, one of the last remaining native kings of the swamp quietly dies in the tall grass. And the panther isn't the only casualty caught in the crossfire. Look up into the canopy. The Everglades is heavily patrolled by red-shouldered hawks, owls, and bald eagles. A bird of prey spots a dead mouse hanging in a branch. It swoops down, grabs the bait, and feeds it to its chicks back in the nest. Entire bloodlines of native raptors could be wiped out by a single bad drop. Then there is the eastern indigo snake. At up to 8 feet long, the indigo is North America's longest native snake. It is a spectacular iridescent blue-black predator that actively hunts and eats other snakes, including juvenile pythons. But the eastern indigo is federally threatened. Scientists are desperately breeding them in captivity just to keep the species alive. If a hungry indigo swallows a dying poison python, the native snake dies right alongside the invader. The profound tragedy is that the native predator dies exactly because it did what Florida needed it to do. It ate the enemy. Suddenly, the ultimate weapon against the python invasion became a loaded gun, pointed indiscriminately at Florida's most protected species. Wildlife officials were staring down a brutal ecological paradox. If they carpet bomb the wetlands with painkillers, they might finally crush the next python generation. But if even one toxic food chain ended in the jaws of a panther or a rare indigo snake, the political and ecological fallout would be absolute devastation. Picture a telemetry screen in a wildlife command center. A GPS collar on a mature female panther sends a steady rhythmic pulse moving through the swamp. Then the blip stops, not from old age, not from a territorial dispute with another cat, but from a human cure that bled into the wrong veins. Florida realized they could not gamble the last true icons of the swamp on a blind chemical drop. Chemicals are an outside force. They spread. They wash into the water table. They do not discriminate. If they couldn't attack the invasion from the outside with poison, they needed a weapon that only targeted pythons. They needed a collapse from the inside. To defeat an enemy perfectly adapted to the Everglades, scientists knew they had to weaponize the snake's own biology against it. They didn't look for a better trap. They didn't look for a deadlier poison. They looked into a microscope. Behind the locked, heavily secured doors of federal laboratories away from the mud, the mosquitoes and the oppressive heat of the swamp, researchers began developing a strategy straight out of a science fiction thriller, genetic biocontrol. Using CRISPR gene editing technology, they realized they didn't have to kill the pythons. They could physically rewrite their DNA. The concept is chillingly brilliant, operating with a ruthless microscopic precision. Here is how the endgame actually looks. Trappers go out into the swamp and capture the largest, healthiest, most aggressive male Burmese pythons they can find. But instead of euthanizing them on the asphalt, biologists load these prime specimens into transport crates and bring them into a sterile lab under bright white LED lights. On the steel tables, they alter the snake's genetic code. They engineer a highly specific mutation known as a gene drive. This isn't a subtle change. It is a forced genetic override that defies the standard rules of reproduction. They insert a sequence that dictates one absolute law: this specific male can now only produce male offspring. Or, in an alternate, equally devastating version of the edit, any female offspring he sires will be born completely sterile. She will never lay a single egg. Once the genetic payload is securely spliced into his DNA, a tracking implant is inserted under his scales. Then the doors are opened. These altered snakes are taken right back to the edge of the Everglades and released into the black water. They become Trojan serpents. A modified male slithers deep into the swamp. He easily bypasses the steel traps. He outswims the human hunters. He doesn't trigger any trail cameras. Driven by millions of years of pure biological instinct, he tracks the pheromones of the massive hidden females lurking in the deep core of the Everglades. He finds the exact breeding giants that human cruise thermal drones and tracking dogs can never reach. They mate. The female slithers away to build her nest. She lays her massive clutch of 100 eggs deep in an inaccessible tree island. She coils her heavy muscular body around them. She shivers to generate heat, fiercely guarding them and incubating them, totally unaware of what is actually growing inside the shells. When the leather-like eggs finally slice open, there is no terrifying new generation of breeding females ready to push the invasion further. Out crawls a dead-end bloodline. A brood of entirely male snakes slides into the water. But they aren't just normal males. They carry the exact same genetic sabotage hidden in their cells, ready to pass it on to the next hidden female they find. This weapon doesn't rely on poison mice rotting in the mud. It doesn't risk the life of a single Florida panther hawk or indigo snake. It takes the python's own primal urge to reproduce and turns it into the mechanism of its own destruction. The invasion spreads the cure itself. Generation by generation, the math irrevocably shifts. Fewer females are born, fewer viable nests are laid. The population silently mathematically collapses under its own weight. But playing God comes with its own terrifying set of questions. What if the gene drive mutates? What if an engineered python is picked up by a massive Category 5 hurricane blown across the ocean and washes ashore in a native habitat where pythons actually belong? You wouldn't just be curing Florida. You could accidentally trigger the extinction of an entire species globally. It is the ultimate high-stakes gamble. Florida's endgame isn't about pulling every single snake out of the mud anymore. It is about letting the Burmese python breed itself into the dark. The Everglades has been fighting a losing, desperate battle for decades. But for the first time, the swamp isn't just trying to survive the serpent. It is rewriting its DNA. So, which gamble would you take, risking the native wildlife with poison bait, or playing God with a predator's DNA? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the strangest mysteries of the natural world, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.